All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us this evening. I'm so excited to have my friends here, Elizabeth and Yuri from Moonshot team, who will be talking to us about some of the harmful online narratives that they've been tracking for us during the duration of this DHS funded program that we've been doing in the Portland Tri-County area for the last 2 years. And this webinar is particularly special because they're not just going to be talking about harmful narratives in general, but with a particular emphasis on some of the election dynamics and the factors that are going into this election season, which is going to conclude in next week. So, without further ado, let me turn it over to Elizabeth and Yuri.
Thanks, Ray. I am excited to be back with you all. I had the privilege of joining you in September, and I think that was good preparation for what we're going to talk about here. I'm not going to go through all of the details of what we covered last September, but maybe just give you a little primer to refresh your memory of some of the things we learned together last year. Um, the agenda for tonight is to remind you about those mistis malinformation narrative uh, precursors, meaning the definitions and how we think about these things. Then we're going to turn a little bit to the big picture, how the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence have put out some recent warnings about active disinformation that and how it is affecting our elections. Then we're going to turn to what we're seeing online in terms of those national and local narratives, some of the religious rhetoric we're seeing in domestic violent extremist spaces, and we'll close out with an explanation or a reminder, really, because we talked about this before, but what can we do? It's a really tense environment, and I think it's helpful to just go back to the basics of how we can help be peace builders in our communities. So, just a reminder, kind of our scope for this particular project was to help educate on some of the harmful narratives that have been occurring in online spaces that affect both religious communities as well as the area around Portland, and more importantly, building resilience to those narratives. These were definitions that we used and we introduced to you back in September. Extremism is the belief that an in-group's success or survival can never be separated from the need for hostile action against the outgroup. Extremism, that hostile action spectrum can range from harassment and discrimination, so non-criminal activities, some activities that might be able to be dealt with in civil court, but generally speaking, are non-criminal. That's the lower end. And then you move into property crime, hate crimes, terrorism, genocide. So there's a spectrum there. And when you're looking at it from a community perspective, we are concerned about that whole range because people don't stay. They don't jump immediately to terrorism. They start on that lower end, and a small percentage progress through to that upper end, that criminal space. So if we're looking to prevent, we want to address from a community perspective, we want to address that lower end of the hostile action spectrum. I say community intentionally because, as you know, the government does not have the ability to police speech and inappropriate, uncivil behavior. So it really is the role of us as citizens to be able to try to reassert norms of civility and the way that we treat one another, even when we disagree with one another. One of the most important things we can do during a tense season that we all find ourselves in. One of the things I want you to know about this extremism definition is that the idea of just fearing that an outgroup poses a threat to you, to your success or survival, that does not in and of itself make you an extremist. It really is tied to the belief that the only solution you have is hostile action. I think that's important because in a political season, it's pretty common for our political rhetoric to say the other side is this is an existential threat. They're going to ruin our lives. fear drives money, drives votes. There's an incentive structure there. It's really hard to get through a season like this and not hear a message that at least embraces that first part of the definition of extremism, but it's not extremist until somebody says, and it's your answer is not to go vote. Your answer isn't to go support a candidate or knock on doors. Your answer is only hostile action. That's when we move into that extremist territory. Misdis and malinformation, these are distinct but related variations of basically false information. So that false information could be a narrative like text, it could be audio, it could be visual. Misinformation is a term that we use to say when false information is unintentionally spread. So the person spreading it doesn't know it's false. So they're not malicious in their intent in sharing it. Disinformation is when the person that originates it or shares it knows that it's not true, and their intent is to deceive or manipulate a person, group, or country. That is primarily what we're concerned about with foreign actors spreading disinformation. Malinformation is information based on a fact, but it's used out of context to mislead or manipulate. That happens in political cycles too. But again, our primary concern in this context is disinformation. And then toxic polarization, you probably remember that buzzword. The idea here is that there's a deepening divide, both ideological, political, and social, that results in extremist rhetoric. So polarization is usually a precursor to extremism. The more polarized we are, the more people are open to this idea that, hey, the only option we have is some form of hostile action. So with those reminders, I have one more slide that might look familiar for you. This was that cycle of how we see misdis and malinformation manifest online. Usually starts at that it's seated on some fringe platform, probably platforms you're not on, but at some point the narrative is crafted, and once that narrative is crafted and it finds ways to support the interests of the individuals or the groups that are spreading the disinformation, it then gets into the mainstream, often deliberately. Foreign actors often do this deliberately, but sometimes it's by a key influencer who might not necessarily be aware that it's disinformation, but their primary motive is, hey, this is sensational. It's going to get me clicks. It's going to get me likes. So I'm going to share it anyway. And it's not really in my interest to vet it and make sure it's true. So we often see information jump from those niche platforms onto the mainstream. It often gets media coverage. And then, of course, sometimes if you're on certain platforms, tech companies might crack down on that. I will tell you the tech companies in this election cycle are being much, much more cautious. They were heavily criticized in 2020 for some of their efforts that were viewed as censorship. So I don't know that we'll see as much of that activity from the tech companies, but sometimes something does at least cross over that barrier and really become a violation of their terms of service. And so they will pull that content down. And then the followers of the conspiracy narratives will often then return to their fringe platforms and the cycle starts over again. Key things to remember, we're all susceptible to disinformation. There are certain vulnerabilities at a person's given stage of life or experience, season of life, if you will, where you might be more vulnerable than other seasons. Disinformation really exploits existing grievances and uncertainty. Election seasons are great for that, lots of uncertainty, and politicians are telling us all the things we should be mad about. So it's a prime season for a foreign actor or others to use disinformation to further sow those grievances. And then, of course, the extremist actors often use those conspiracy theories, the disinformation for their purposes, which is they want to manipulate you to get to the point where you think the only choice I have is that hostile action. I'm going to come join your group, join your militia, join your movement to cause harm in some way. Okay, bringing us to the present. This is the Homeland Threat Assessment that the Department of Homeland Security published at the beginning of October. There's a whole host of interesting things in that document. It's an annual assessment that they publish. But I pulled out this paragraph because I wanted to highlight their assessment as it pertains to the election cycle, that it will be an attractive target for many adversaries. They are concerned about both domestic violent extremists, so those are people in the United States who might adhere to a variety of ideologies, that they would look to target both indirectly and directly things that are associated with elections as a viable target for violence with the intent of instilling fear among voters, candidates, and election workers. They also highlighted that we have a number of nation state aligned foreign malign influence actors who, quote, almost certainly will continue, meaning they're already doing it, to target democratic processes with the aims of affecting U.S. voter preferences, exacerbating social tensions, and undermining confidence in our democratic institutions and the integrity of the electoral process. And then this next slide is going to dive in a little more to that actor, the threat actor of the foreign nation state. The intelligence community has been updating and putting out bulletins almost every 15 days. And we just saw them in the last week start to do near real-time attribution of disinformation. From a big picture standpoint, the intelligence community has assessed, and this is not new, by the way, they assessed this in 2020, that Russia prefers the former president, that would be Donald Trump. Iran prefers the vice president, that would be Kamala Harris. And China is not seeking to influence the presidential election, but that does not get them off the hook. That it was recently came out that they have been trying to hack candidates and campaign senior staff phones. So they are trying to collect data, but China tends to be what I would consider that enemy with a long-term vision for what their goals are. So they use traditional spycraft. And then that second bullet is rather interesting. And we've seen this for quite some time, but I don't think it gets nearly as much attention as we probably should be paying to it, which is that both Russia and China are interfering in congressional and state and local races. They do this based on their perception of how a candidate's foreign policy would impact them and their national security interests. So you can imagine that China might support a candidate who does not want the United States to defend Taiwan. Russia might back a candidate who has said that we should not be providing more aid to Ukraine. So this, when it's laid out like this, you realize like it's not that complicated. They want certain things, and they're supporting the candidates that they think will help them achieve those aims that they have. Just for those that didn't get to join us in September, this is not new. Russia has been at this game in its current form since 2014. Iran, China, North Korea have all started to do this as well, beginning in 2018 cycle and the 2020 cycle. So this is not new. But I think what's concerning is that they continue at this game in part because they are very successful. The main aim here is not necessarily one elected officials being voted in over another, though they would like, they do assess Russia likes one and Iran likes the other. But that's giving them too easy of a pass. What they're really after is getting us to fight with each other. What they're really after is destroying any sort of unity that we have as a country, so that if we ever need to oppose them when they are doing something they shouldn't, like Ukraine or building nuclear weapons, that we are so divided that we can't come together and fight that enemy. So this is a pretty old playbook, been around since pre-KGB days, 1920s. Stalin created the concept of disinformation. So this is not a new tactic. It's just been weaponized with the ability to seed things so easily through social media. And that is what makes our particular moment so challenging. I'm going to now turn it over to my colleague, Yuri. We're going to talk about more than just foreign disinformation, but I want you to keep in the back of your mind, we at Moonshot don't always know, it's up to the intelligence community to attribute who is seeding, meaning who is planting the ideas, and then who is sharing the ideas. And in 2016, The seeding primarily came from Russia. And in 2020, the seeding primarily came from Americans, but the amplification came from Russia. So troll farms would take some influencer's narrative and make it blow up to be a much bigger deal than it actually was. So the ability to attribute who is doing what is mostly left to the intel community, and they are more transparent right now because of the election cycle trying to debunk when things are getting posted that are clearly not real. But we don't always know. So keep that in the back of your mind when you're coming across information on the internet. If it seems sensational, that should be your first check. Mm, sensational sells, sensational gets you a click. There might be more to this story. All right, Yuri, I'm turning it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. So I'm going to go over some of our key findings. This it comes from, so what we looked at was MDM and DV, that is domestic violent extremist narratives, on two different platforms, Gab and Telegram. These are two of the most popular platforms for the spread of mis and disinformation and also extremist communities online. And so I'll be going through the collection that we did between March of last year and July of this year, and then also I'll give you a look at our previous results that was carried out from January 2020 to February 2023. Also go through some election-related MDM narratives. So lots of these employ what we're calling us versus them framing, trying to pit different communities apart, and also the dehumanization and villainizing of the out group, which we'll get into some specific details about that. One thing that's important to note is that what we're witnessing is that DV actors are continuing to take advantage of legitimate political grievances and within faith-based communities to align themselves with conservative religious groups. And this happens in very commonly with all sorts of different contexts. DV actors are really good at finding issues, hot button issues, and legitimate political grievances, and then spinning those, spreading misinformation to try to get people to align with their group or groups that they support. So one of the most prominent narratives that we're seeing are sort of deep state and anti-LGBTQ plus narratives, which we'll talk about a little bit, but these are, allegations that a shadowy cabal is controlling the government. QAnon is sort of a big conspiracy theory within this world, but this has existed from before, and some of the terms that you'll see actually come predate QAnon, but have definitely become more amplified since that's become very popular. So here you can see this is from the previous reporting period, and you can see some of the more popular keywords that we tracked when we were doing the data collection. You could see the first one, WEF, that's the World Economic Forum. There's lots of conspiracy theories that they're implementing various other things, trying to sort of take over the whole world, trying to limit freedom of speech, trying to limit people's freedom to where they live. There's conspiracy theories about so-called 15-minute cities where the allegation is that you'll be limited to your certain neighborhood, even things as far as what you can eat. There's quite a few different QAnon ones that you can see here. The second most popular term, this is a QAnon slogan that's quite popular. And then some, you can see that a lot of the other terms are, along those same lines. In this current reporting period, you'll see a lot of the same sort of narratives as well. I'll also point out that a lot of these conspiracy theories, even people who are sharing them, they may not be aware, but a lot of them are very intrinsically tied to anti-Semitism. You can see here the ADL is a popular term. That is the Anti-Defamation League. That is their mission is to fight anti-Semitism, and they're often accused of similar anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that they control the government, that they control the FBI, that the FBI and the government is doing their bidding to target people that supposedly the Jewish community don't like. But yeah, so a lot of these conspiracy theories, even sometimes the people spreading them aren't aware of them, they have lots of origins in anti-Semitism and are used to spread anti-Semitism. And as I was mentioning, sort of hot button issues, you see DEI, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. Just different efforts to make companies, to make organizations more multicultural and more diverse. These are often used as scapegoats by DV communities for any bad thing that happens. I'm sure everyone's seen all the issues that Boeing has had. That is something that has been blamed on DEI without evidence, of course. And then I'm based in DC. A few months ago, a bridge here collapsed, and that was blamed on DEI somehow. So that's become it's a big talking point in sort of current narratives, and then we can see how it's being employed by DV actors to spread mis and disinformation. Now, I'll talk about some of more the election-related mis and disinformation that we're seeing. So these are quite common, and they involve a range of sort of topics: ballot stuffing, mail-in ballot fraud, dead people voting, and voter machine fraud. A lot of these have been around for quite a long time, but it's clear that they've sort of become amplified and more commonplace after the 2020 election, and they've even expanded into other areas. One sort of It would be humorous if it wasn't so important, but this allegation that the government controls the weather and is using that to affect the elections. We saw that with the recent hurricanes that hit North Carolina. And one thing that's pertinent to this is these narratives use this us versus them framing that we're talking about. In this case, us being, patriotic Americans, them being shadowy government, Democrats, liberals, lots of Jewish communities. It can be applied to lots of other groups, immigrants. One thing that we have seen with allegations of voter fraud, we see calls to violence and actual encouragement to commit electoral fraud. So some of these narratives go that, the other side is cheating, so we need to cheat harder in order to counteract this cheating. So they're actual individuals who are calling for burning ballot boxes, but also conducting illegal ballot harvesting, forging, other people's votes, things of that nature. And here you can see some quotations that were identified from some of the DV spaces. So what's really worrying about this election fraud sort of conspiracy theories is this idea that if the elections are stolen and there's no legitimate way to participate in the political process, then the next step is to engage in violence. And so you can see here that these quotations are calling exactly for that. I won't read this in full. I'm sure you guys can read this as well, but this is from the Brennan Center that has done some really good reporting on threats to election officials. And we can see that 1 in 6 election officials have experienced threats because of their job. And the majority of them say that these threats have increased in recent years. Other organizations, NCITE at the University of Omaha, they've been doing a lot of reporting this as well. And this really has had an impact on how these individuals are able to do their jobs. Some have had to leave their homes or put their children into counseling. And so these sorts of attacks against the electoral process make it more difficult for elections to run smoothly and for the democratic process to proceed as it should. And we're seeing that these threats happen online all the time, which is mainly what we observe, but they also occur in the real world with direct emails, direct calls, mail, even showing up to these officials' place of business or homes. And so this is something that's been really concerning in the last few years. Now, a lot of this election misinformation also becomes intertwined with sort of conspiracy theories about immigrants and non-citizens who are in the country. So one very, very prevalent narrative in these spaces is that Democrats are allowing or encouraging or facilitating non-citizens to vote in elections. This is a very common one that, as I said, this is not something that is new. This has been around for quite a long time, but something that has definitely accelerated. And even just within this election cycle, we've been seeing it accelerate as we get closer and closer to the election. These sort of fear-mongering tactics, it's used to sort of provoke fear and make people angry about immigrants in their own community, stating that you shouldn't accept them because they're going to be used to steal your right to vote, to water down your vote, things of that nature, engage in election fraud. And so at Moonshot, as part of a project that I work on, we track threats against different communities, and we saw a pretty substantial increase in threats against immigrants in August and September. In October, we're still parsing through that data, but I can imagine that it will also be similarly high. And so this quotation here kind of shows that in addition to sort of conspiracy theories that illegal immigrants are disproportionately violent and criminal, now there's also this narrative that they're also going to illegally vote, and that is the purpose. That is why they're so-called being allowed into the country. That it's not just that there's lots of immigration into the U.S., but that it's a deliberate tactic by politicians to strengthen their voter base illegally. One sort of case study that we wanted to bring to your attention. I'm sure many of you are aware of these claims that Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, were eating people's pets. So this was really amplified during one of the a debate by former President Donald Trump. And so this actually had a lot of real world consequences, a lot of real world effects. We saw residents who were in government, but also who were just deemed to be supportive of the Haitian migrants. They were doxxed, which means their personal information was released online in a malicious manner. So where they live, also where their children go to school, things of that nature. We saw calls for violence, hoax bomb threats, death threats against these individuals. And also, what's interesting to note, worryingly, was that this also spread to other locations. So the main focus was on the Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, but this sort of narrative actually spread nationwide, and other places that had a high number of Haitian or other immigrants were also targeted. And these claims that they were involved in pet eating, we saw that in other locations as well. There were claims that in New York, communities there were eating pets and also using them in voodoo rituals. So that sort of shows you how these narratives can be hyper focused on a local place, but can spread elsewhere. And here on the right, you can see this is an AI generated image that was shared by a neo-Nazi group that shows an alleged Haitian immigrant in Ohio eating a pet. We have seen lots of the use of AI to create these kinds of images to spread this rhetoric. One thing I'll note: these images they're not shared into fooling people into thinking they're real images. I think most people looking at this image can very quickly identify that it's AI generated. The purpose is not to fool people. The purpose is to sort of spread the message in easily digestible ways so it can be reshared, achieve virality. And we're seeing that happen in lots of different contexts, whether it's election related or just targeting certain communities, as we're seeing here. Now, I'll talk about some sort of local narratives that we're seeing in the Portland area. So one of the big ones is this sort of emphasis on the urban-rural social political divide in Oregon, claiming that, you know, certain segments are more extreme than others, and how this is really fueling toxic polarization. So the Greater Idaho movement is a frequent topic of discussion in these MDM and DV spaces. Claims that Oregon is fundamentally hostile to conservatives, and that Oregon is actually more red than its representation. So here we see some of these election misinformation narratives come into play here. This claim that, you know, if voting was secure and voting was legitimate, then Oregon, the political map in Oregon would be much different than it actually is. So it's alleging that the government is sort of is working to sort of silence conservatives or red voters in the state. We also see sometimes how certain government policies are misrepresented in a way to make it look like the government is fundamentally hostile to its citizens. So one that happened was discussions about the water use policy for, you know, there was discussions about how to limit how much water farmers can use in order to make sure that the water is not depleted. This has been really been promoted as a war against local farmers by the government. And going back to some of the more broader narratives, this is actually something that we're seeing a lot of in DV spaces. This allegation that the government is trying to control what food you eat. We see this at sort of the international level with organizations like the World Economic Forum, but also at the local level. So when we see, for example, there were a series of like factories or processing plants that had accidents, and these are, instead of, you know, being accurately reported as accidents or, you know, malfunctions, they are described as a government attempt to limit the food supply. And so you see that on the local level in Oregon as well. I think you skipped one there. Yeah, thank you. So another narrative that is very prominent nationally and in Oregon as well is sort of these anti-LGBTQ plus narratives. So this idea or this narrative that members of the LGBTQ plus community are pedophiles or groomers. This is something that has been, again, was started decades ago, but sort of has gained a resurgence. And this is a clear example of emotional manipulation. Of course, everyone is concerned about the welfare of children, and pedophilia is a huge issue. But they're using these strong emotional feelings to depict an entire community as being associated with this terrible thing. And even more narrowly, this is really a lot of it has really been targeting the trans community. There's this idea or this narrative that members of the trans community are trying to forcibly transition children, keep it secret from their parents, and that events where these LGBTQ plus community and the trans community are present, they are attempts to sort of indoctrinate children into the so-called lifestyle. As a result of that, we see lots of in-person activities by DVE groups. So lots of Pride Month celebrations. I see lots of protests, drag queen story hour type events. We see neo-Nazi groups protest these sometimes with very explicit calls for violence. There was one prominent group that they chanted "There will be blood" at numerous of these events, and sometimes this has led to sort of clashes and police intervention. But I would say it's probably since the last election, a lot of extremist groups have shifted a bit away from participating in public political events, and a lot of that sort of effort actually has gone to opposing LGBTQ plus events of this kind. We also wanted to mention this particular case that took place in Oregon. So Anarchist Violent Extremist blog, or AVE blog, they set a wood bridge on fire near Milwaukee, Oregon. And so what was interesting about this case was this was carried out because this bridge was used by extractive industries to move material around. But this was actually part of an international anarchist campaign that is being promoted by this a German blog called "Switch Off the System of Destruction." And so what's interesting about this case, and you see this a lot with sort of the violent anarchist movements, there's this huge concept of solidarity, so of carrying out actions around the world and around the country to support a very specific thing. And this is an example of that. So this was inspired internationally, but carried out by a group locally. It's not to say that these groups have any official or even unofficial links, but groups are often inspired internationally. And so this is sort of playing on some existing grievances that individuals might have. Lots of individuals are concerned about the climate and climate change and how certain industries can be impacting that. And so some of these extremist actors, they sort of tie into that, and they sort of try to get people to not just protest, not just engage in the political process, but carry out acts of vandalism and destruction. So we're seeing that quite often. A whole different host of industries being targeted, including electric vehicles as well. So this is one a quotation that sort of exemplifies what I was discussing about this idea that Oregon is much more red or much more Republican than what is being actually misrepresented, and that is actually represented. And this is interesting because you see it mentions 1988 with mail-in balloting. So you see here that we're using sort of more modern narratives about election fraud, about mail-in balloting, and using it retrospectively to comment on events that have happened in the past. So now they're saying that not just election fraud hasn't just been happening since 2020 or 2016, but far before that. So it's sort of a reinterpretation of past historical events using the newer forms of misinformation. This is something that we covered just last week, actually. And so we were seeing extremists on, if you could say, both sides discussing election day and any potential violence. And both sides are stating that they believe the other side will engage in violence. And so they were preparing for this violence. And there have been calls to go to Portland specifically during election day in order to counteract what they believe will be violence from the other side. And this is, as I said, this is happening from both sides. So whether this is a Trump win or a Harris win, there's this idea that will be violence from the opposite side. And this sort of also employs the sort of us versus them framing, sort of positioning the other side as extremist. And so you also need to engage in violence in order to defend yourself or defend what they believe is the proper electoral process. So we're forecasting that there is a heightened risk on election day itself because of this. And I would say this is also very specific in the Portland area. We haven't seen this as much in other areas of the country. So that is, and I'm sure as many of you know, Portland has been the site of sort of these clashes between two different opposing groups. So I will say, not to sort of over-index on this, there hasn't been massive discussions about this, but that is something that we noticed and wanted to bring to your attention. Now we'll move on to sort of how religious rhetoric is being used by DV actors, extremist actors, and how they sort of use this to recruit and to blend their beliefs. So, as I said, they take legitimate conservative religious beliefs and take a look at grievances that are in sort of the mainstream and sort of use it to align themselves with new audiences. So one thing, for example, is the use of anti-Semitism, claiming that the Christian faith is inherently anti-Semitic, and so therefore, if you're a true Christian, you should be anti-Semitic. And then also using this to sort of tie it into other social, political, or economic grievances. So a lot of these narratives sometimes blend. One thing we just mentioned, the anti-immigrant rhetoric. Sometimes this is described as being a ploy by Jewish communities, that they're intentionally bringing in immigrants in order to cause chaos, and then also for electoral representation. And so we see that a lot of these groups, they sort of try to use the religion angle to get people on their side. You see here in some of the quotes, Talmudism, and they try to really differentiate the Jewish and Christian religions, saying that they have nothing in common and that you need to eliminate all kinds of Jewishness from your belief system, and sort of positioning Christians and Jews as diametrically opposed. And of course, this also applies to other faith systems as well. Yeah, as I just said, this us versus them thinking, as a part of that is this idea that Christianity is under attack, that the opposing side are communists or they're atheists, they're anti-Christianity. So a lot of times actions and developments are viewed as sort of an attack on Christianity itself, and we see that in relation to elections as well. So one candidate is portrayed as anti-Christian, and that voting them is a betrayal of one's faith, or it means that you're not actually a Christian if you vote for this person. This is something that's referred to as a false dichotomy. The idea that one side is Christian, one side is not. If you're a Christian, you do this. If you're a Christian, you don't do that. It's just another example of how extremists and people who peddle misinformation, they really try to appeal to things that are important to people to get them on their side. In this case, their faith. And I'll hand it back over to Elizabeth so we can get some positive stuff, what we can do about this.
Thanks, Yuri. I want to kind of talk about that last slide that you had. There was a study that More in Common put out in September, and it was looking at the perceptions that people have, and then what people actually believe among various religions in the United States. And one of the questions that they asked people across faith groups is whether they feel like their faith is under attack. And what Yuri can attest to is that when I saw that people identifying as Jewish or people identifying as Muslim, around 40–50% said that they are scared and they feel like they're under attack. Based on what we see online, that's reasonable. They are, especially in this last year, have faced a tremendous amount of hate and just it's a very tense time for those communities. And so it makes sense to me that they're scared. What I found really odd is that the percentage of people as Christians who believe that their faith is being under attack and that they're scared was higher. It was 63%. And as a practicing Christian, and as a, being in the counterterrorism field, I'm not sure if the facts are backing up the fear that is very legitimate. I mean, they're saying I'm scared. I'm not questioning that. They are scared, but I'm not sure if the facts back up that we need to be as scared as we seem to be in the country. So just something to think about. And we can get that link to the More in Common study if you're interested in digging into that more. So I want to talk a little bit about the manipulation techniques. Yuri talked through some of them as he was giving you some examples of narratives, but it's important if you can become more aware of these techniques when you come across a narrative that uses it, you're more likely to uh, kind of slightly go, oh, hold on, that looks like it's scapegoating. Let me double check this. And it's a good protective factor that we all should have in our life of understanding the logic fallacies and the techniques that disinformation actors use. Scapegoating is one of those classic ones that you're blaming an individual or a group, the other, for problems that they did not primarily cause. We do that a lot in our politics, right? So this one's pretty prevalent in our community. False dichotomies, we just covered that, this idea of a logical fallacy in which two choices or sides are falsely presented as the only available options. And often those options aren't mutually exclusive. And the fact that there are reasonable alternatives are available, when the person spinning the narrative, they conceal that. So they use deception to kind of make it seem like this really is the only two choices, but in fact, there could be alternatives or nuanced ways to view it. In general, I would say what we know about people that gravitate towards extremism, they tend to be very black and white thinkers, and they tend to have kind of a closed mindset. They're not open, they're not curious, and there's like a propensity to not be okay with being proven wrong. Look, nobody likes to be wrong, but like the idea of having somebody demonstrate to you that you were incorrect about something, we can choose to view that as like a learning opportunity, as, oh, okay, I learned something new today, or we can close that off and push back and not be open to learning. I mentioned this in particular for those of you that are parents. Really, really important skill for us to be investing in our kids, or if you're a youth leader, this idea that, especially when our kids are really young, when my daughter was in third grade, like that black and white thinking is very strong, and teaching them messages of, well, there might be more to the story, or teaching them just the principle of grace from the Christian perspective. Those are really important protective factors you can build up in your children, so that when they're adults, they're less likely to succumb to some of these false dichotomies, black and white thinking. Emotional manipulation. Like I said earlier, anything that's super sensational, it's a good thing to check that whatever you're reading is actually true. Emotionally charged language is often used to manipulate our emotions, rather than presenting valid arguments to garner our support. I see this a lot in appeals to protect our kids. And hey, I'm a big fan of protecting our kids. If you want to get me emotional, mess with my kids, right? So anytime you're seeing something that you notice, like, oh yeah, that's riling me up, that's a good check for us to take a deep breath and let's dig deeper, and make sure that whoever's presenting this information might be correct. I mean, there are bad things that happen in this world. I'm not suggesting that everything that's happening in our country is awesome. It's not, but let's make sure that we're basing our decisions, basing our actions on facts, and not sensational arguments that are designed to manipulate. And lastly, fear mongering. This is I started my career actually in the political side of the game, so I'm saying this as somebody that has been in and out of political campaigns. Fear mongering gets you votes. So we're in the season of fear mongering. The concept is any type of story that's deliberately exaggerating or provoking fear or alarm about a particular issue or individual. So those are some of the most common to look for as you are engaging with information online. What can you do about this? You've seen this slide before. We talked about this in September. A couple of ideas for folks, and we can dig into some of these in the Q&A if you'd like. If you are engaging with somebody who is engaging with maybe conspiracy theories or really intense about their perspective on things, it's hard to have a conversation without going into disagreement. My recommendation is that you keep lines of communication open. And there's a balance here. We want to offer affirmation for grievances, like I hear your grievance. Oh, I can see how that is painful, without supporting the false or hostile narratives that might accompany them. So it doesn't help to dismiss people out of hand. When I mean, I will tell you, like I struggled with this, some of the hurricane narratives that the government was creating the hurricane, or the Democrats or the deep state were creating the hurricane. That is on its face just almost preposterous. But what might be going on beneath the surface is people grappling with, like, wow, that is a really scary hurricane. And how did that happen so fast? And they're scrambling to look for some way to explain something that is really hard to see happen. And certainly some of the people that created that narrative, that's not what's going on. But the people that believe that narrative or open to that narrative, there's usually something else going on in that person's life. So your hope is to maintain relationship with that person. You can gently suggest, I've heard some other explanations. I'm not sure I agree with that. But again, you're not trying to fight with them. You're not trying to change their mind. You're trying to maintain relationship. That's the most important thing when you're engaging with somebody that's caught up in some of these conspiracy theories. That relationship is what's going to allow you to eventually make suggestions, whether it's connecting with them at a faith level, and maybe inviting them to your church or to a Bible study to go deeper to see what's going on in their life, or maybe just being a good friend, and when they're ready to let go of that belief for whatever reason it's meeting some unmet need, maybe you're that safe person that they can turn to that hasn't made fun of them or dismissed them for having some of these beliefs. Support the right to hold distinct beliefs and cultivate strong media literacy and discernment to identify potentially harmful narratives. One of the things I think that communities such as yours can do, that model is so needed in our community, is this idea that we can disagree with one another and we can do it civilly and we can still be friends. So finding ways to respect that we have different beliefs, while also being people of the truth, searching for how do we get the ground facts here, or find the common facts that we can agree on, and then maybe find the common values that we believe on, even if we disagree on the solutions to those facts and those values. When you're embraced, or sorry, when you engage that friction, one of the recommendations we have is, instead of approaching it as I got to figure out how to convince you you're wrong, approach it from a place of curiosity. We encourage questioning, ask questions in an open-ended manner, seeking to genuinely understand. If you approach that conversation with the intent to change their mind, they're going to pick up on that. So it really is important that your genuine intent and your questions are done in such a way that you are being curious and seeking to understand, as opposed to seeking to change somebody's mind. Approach activities with the understanding that adherence to violent extremist ideology is often more significantly driven by psychosocial factors rather than the specific narrative that has been offered. I touched on this at the beginning, and then just earlier with one of the earlier bullets here. The underlying psychosocial factors that we believe are most common in individuals that move to extremist movements are the need for significance and the need for belonging. That is, on one level, very oversimplified for a very complex issue of why people move to extremism, and on another, maybe not, because as human beings, we all have the need to feel like we matter, and we have the need for belonging. And in our country these days, we are very, very lonely. And it is increasingly hard to find meaning in life, especially the way that the culture talks about where you search for that meaning. So the fact that we have a lot of people that are hurting and looking for that meaning means that we're going to have more people vulnerable to some of these extremist narratives. So when you're engaging with somebody that might be in that space, whether it's conspiracy theories or actually engaging extremist narratives, recognize that what you're really trying to go after is how can you possibly help meet that need of significance and belonging. And that's obviously not something you can do in one conversation. It's going to take time. We want to cultivate an understanding of the forms that dehumanizing language takes. This kind of moves us into that space I was talking about at the beginning of how do we reduce the number of people working in that lower end of the hostile action space. It requires members of the community to assert that we're going to treat one another with dignity and respect. I can disagree with you, and I don't have to other you in the process. I don't have to dehumanize you. We teach this to our kids, right? We don't let our kids call other kids bad names, but increasingly in a variety of spaces, both online and offline, we have adults behaving very uncivilly to one another. And so reasserting that we can reclaim that civility is a really important step. And believe it or not, actually has a drastic impact on reducing violence, because it is a process. Nobody ever jumps to terrorism. They start in a space and in a permission structure where hostile action is embraced at that lower end. And if it is viewed as like the norm and okay to act that way, then you're going to have a whole lot more people in that on that space that are vulnerable to doing more. Finally, focus on humanizing the individuals in the out-group and in the in-group. You can do this through proximity. You can do this through proximity locally. It might mean just finding another community group that has different beliefs than you. It might be going on a trip to a different part of the country, maybe even in a different part of the world. Just getting outside of our bubble and meeting people that hold different beliefs, but actually discovering their humanity and how it's neat that they have different experiences and different beliefs. That creates a protective factor for us and for our loved ones. One more slide, and then and I apologize, I went through all of that and I didn't actually have that slide up. This is what happens when I control my own slides and I'm talking. So I'm going to leave that one up so you guys can see that. And then just last kind of point that I want to share, in this election cycle, we do expect it to be challenging, and we wanted to give you some suggestions about trusted election resources. You can always go to your Secretary of State's online voters guide. You can go to vote.gov, which contains a wide variety of election information, including an overview of election processes, your voter rights, and information on how your vote is kept safe. We highly recommend local news sources. And I realize that in a lot of spaces, they're a dying breed. We don't have as many local papers and as many local broadcast TVs and radios, but where you do have it, that is often some of the best, most reliable sources. And then you definitely want to double check whatever you might be seeing on social media or from hearing from a friend. Again, if it feels sensational, go to one of these sources. Go to your Secretary of State, go to the election division, go to your local news, go to vote.gov, go to a trusted source to verify. Now, look, those trusted sources take time. It is so much easier to create something and throw it up on social media unvetted. And it takes a longer period of time for local news and for government officials to get confirmation of when something has happened or hasn't happened, and to post that information. So patience is key these next few weeks. We're going to be going through a lot of a chaotic media environment, and It will be important that we all have patience and encourage others to have patience and maintain calm. The last thing I might suggest is those election officials, when you go to vote, or maybe you're near your county clerk, make a point to go say thank you to them. It's been a hard couple of years for them, and they're nervous. They've got a hefty job in front of them. So if you know them, and you want to send them a note or a text saying like, thanks for your service to our community. I'm praying for you. How can I help you? How can I encourage you? That matters at a time like this. So if you have the ability to reach out and encourage those officials, that would be a really nice thing to do in the coming days and weeks. Ray, I think we did pretty good on time, so we now have time for some questions. And I'm going to show this next slide since I got off so you can just see those recommendations, but we can start with questions.
Let me first say thank you to both Elizabeth and Yuri, and a round of applause, virtual applause to you both for such insightful information, but also very helpful suggestions. Something you said earlier, I think, reminded me of, weirdly enough, Alexis de Tocqueville. He, I think it was when you said that polarization is often a precursor for extremism. And Tocqueville, writing back in the 1700s, made a similar observation where he said it is the kind of associational, thriving civic space in America that's going to actually stand against despotism that everybody was fearful of. And I think kind of a historical echo that we're hearing now. And then Robert Putnam, not too long ago, 3 decades ago, wrote about, bowling alone and how the disintegration of some of our social ties is actually weakening our social fabric and making us easy prey for some of these really dangerous dynamics to take root. And so, yeah, thank you so much to you both. And yeah, I do want to prioritize our guests who have stayed on with us. So yeah, turning it over to our participants, if you all have any questions, we will invite you to unmute yourself and ask away.